And I'd like to welcome you to one of the lectures in the series on selfhood that's sponsored by the Institute for Philosophy and Religion. This evening we're privileged to have with us Dr. John Mack, who's a professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and at Cambridge City Hospital. It's my pleasure to present to you Dr. John Mack.
Thank you very much. It's a little hard to talk these days without having in mind the context in which we're all living right now in this time of war, and my remarks will touch on this. I'm not going to be directly discussing the war, but there is a obvious tie-in in some of the things that I'm going to be saying. The title of this is Toward a Spiritual Point of View in Psychoanalysis, and I'm going to say what the points of view in psychoanalysis are and how this connects in, and then what a spiritual point of view or attitude in psychoanalysis would be, as I see it. Then I'm going to touch on what the implications are for our notions of self, how we would need to define or change, modify the idea of self in that context. I'm going to speak briefly about some of the clinical implications of this way of thinking, and then finally relate these ideas to the world crisis, political crisis that we're now dealing with. The notion of points of view refers to a 1959 paper by Rappaport and Gill, and has to do with ways of looking at psychological phenomena. And there are 5 points of view that they set out. The dynamic point of view has to do with the psychological forces with which we deal in our lives. The second is the economic point of view, which concerns psychological energies, the economy of our being, the relative amount we invest in one set of ideas or one relationship or another. Third is the structural point of view, which has to do with those more or less permanent configurations with the psyche that we find so difficult to change. Fourth is the genetic point of view, which has to do with the origins of our psychological thinking, of the beginnings of our conflicts. The fifth point of view is the adaptive, which has to do with our relationship to the environment, to reality, to the outside world. One which I might add has been relatively late in reaching the prominence that it obviously deserves in any psychological theory. Now, the sixth point of view, the spiritual, is what I want to discuss, or the possibility of a sixth point of view is what I want to talk about here. Now, why do we need this sixth point of view? What's going on? I think it stems from the relative bankruptcy of the human condition as many people, particularly in the West, are experiencing it now. We've come to a kind of dead end in terms of our materialist view of reality. And by materialist, I'm not talking about material in the sense of gathering material goods, although that may be true too. I'm referring rather to a view of the world which says that the physical material world as we know it, the concrete things we can touch, feel, see with our senses, that's all there is. I'm referring to the materialism in the philosophical sense. Philip Cushman, a psychologist, refers to the empty self. Again, this sense that there's something missing, there's something incomplete. Something has gone wrong in the way we are experiencing our lives. Our patients reflect this in the kinds of disorders we're seeing now. They tend to be disorders that relate to that empty self, addictive disorders, for instance, or personality disorders, or situations which people abuse one another in their rage and hurt and frustration, which reflect this kind of emptiness, relate to the disruption of social relationships. All of these current disorders reflect the unmet hungers which people increasingly are experiencing. Many of the new treatment forms that sprouting up around us go by the name of holistic medicine, or the alternative treatments that seem to involve bringing strong spiritual elements into the therapy, reflect this unmet human need. The world crises on this small planet also call for us to relook at the psyche from this spiritual point of view. The international political situation, the conflict in the Gulf, the ecological crisis that we're facing, the increasing death of species, the exhaustion of resources, are forcing us to re-examine who we are, our relationships with one another, individually and collectively, our definitions of the self. Now, in trying to define a spiritual point of view, I begin with experience. And this is not new experience. This is the recapturing, if you will, of experience that has been known through the centuries, indeed through the millennia of human awareness. We can see the kind of experience I'm talking about in dramatic form, in religious conversions, in peak experiences, in mystical experiences, where people feel suddenly there's an opening, there's a sense that something has changed, there's a transformation of the sense of self and a connection with nature, with others that had not been experienced before. Barbara Marx Hubbard, who is belongs in this character of people that get called futurists, wrote this that relates to our increasing awareness of mystical experiences in our time. She said, "I thought that what sexuality was to the Victorian age, mystical experiences to ours. Almost everyone experiences it, but almost no one dares to speak of it. We have been dominated by a scientific materialist culture which has made us feel embarrassed about our natural spiritual natures. Yet we read that 60% of the American people have had mystical experiences. We are a nation of repressed mystics." I don't know how many of you, I hesitate to ask you in front of one another, how many of you have had what you would call mystical. Would you like to see a show of hands on this? This might be a little dangerous. Okay, how many of you have had what you might call a mystical experience in your lives? Well, that's at least half, okay. Now, how many of you have written about it in your academic work or spoken about it publicly? Raise your hands. 2 or 3, okay. It worked out okay, I didn't know. It's a little risky when you do that kind of thing. You know, Then there are the less dramatic ways of arriving at experiences which might be considered spiritual. This can be through through the experience of meditation, through our relationships with one another, through workshops that we do, through artistic activity. We'll talk more about that. All of these experiences have in common the sense that there is another reality behind the manifest reality, behind this material, so-called sensory motor reality. And that's been described in various ways. It's been experienced as the sense of the numinous, or of the divinity of creation. It's the sense that we have in mystical states, in other spiritual states, in religious states, that the universe didn't develop this kind of intricate design by chance, that there is a kind of sense of connection, that things are put together in some exquisite, magnificent way, which we can't quite fathom, but it's not just this cold, indifferent sort of chance throwing together of a lot of matter into and energy into space. Another way of making the distinction I'm talking about is the distinction between the hylotropic and the holotropic. That's the language of Stanislav Grof, who has done experiments with LSD and more recently with the holotropic breath method, which brings a holotropic breath method brings non-ordinary states of consciousness to ordinary people without LSD through deep, rapid breathing, evocative music, and eye shades. And in that state, people can move into this awareness of this reality that lies behind the manifest. It's the mythic realm, the realm that native peoples have known. It's the spirit world that shamanic healers have known and have themselves learned to access through non-ordinary states of consciousness. Small children are aware of this, although they are cut off from it by the rather strict definitions that they encounter from us as to what is real. I recently saw a 3-year-old girl who started out in her meeting with me to tell me very earnestly about her parents and her life, and she has a mommy and a daddy and a brother, and very hylotropic, and where she went to school. And then she began to talk about, and then there was the fox, and the fox came, and the fox got killed by the bear, and pretty soon, but she got a wand, and the magic fairy came and stabbed the bear, and the bear came back to life, and pretty soon I was in this whole shamanic world of spirits and animals, and it was just as real for her as the hylotropic material world, and she was in no way a disturbed child. This was simply that for her, this world of spirits and animals and magic and myth was real. It was this world of spirit behind, or along with, if you like, the world that we generally consider to be real. Now, in this other world, there is the fear that we experience as we go into these spirit realms, as well as the exaltation that comes with it. There is sadness in this realm, and there is joy. And the paths that access this other world can be quite scary to us. I was saying in the seminar this afternoon that there is, in the New Age in California, there is a great interest in this spirit world, in discovering this numinous reality, but they want to find only the good stuff, the divine that you can experience through sun and through the hot tubs, and it's kind of like in the birth matrices that Dr. Groff talks about. It's like people want to experience the divinity of being in the womb, the glory of being born, but not, metaphorically speaking, the terrible struggles that are and darkness that are in the birth canal, which metaphorically tie in with the images of war and peace and hell and all that demonic kind of experience, which is also part of this holotropic realm. This other world, this numinous world, the spirit world that I'm talking about, is the world that calls forth the language of the sacred and is experienced in sacred terms. For this is the only language that somehow seems adequate to describe it. This is why words like soul and spirit and transcendence and reverence and faith are inextricably tied up in our way of thinking and feeling when we are in touch with this world. In psychoanalysis, it has been a tradition to reduce the experience of this world to a kind of childlike wish fulfillment, or return of the adult to the experience of the infant at the breast. And this, as Ken Wilber and others have pointed out, is a kind of category error. It's as if to say this is not a real or a higher or a transcendent experience. It's nothing but a return to that infantile mother infant tie, which may affect the quality of that experience, but is not, it is not simply the experience itself. Now, it's interesting to think about this historically, and this goes beyond what I can go into in detail, but throughout history, and among virtually all native peoples, human beings have been aware of this other realm, this numinous realm, the realm that shamanic healers can access. But we've somehow cut ourselves off from this. And I wonder often how or why we have done this. And the only thing I've been able to come to about this is that we have developed in some kind of hypertrophied way reason or rationality in order to master and control one another, to have power over one another through technology and through our power and technology to dominate the material world. And Mircea Eliade, who is a historian of religion, has written that this is a tendency that apparently all peoples do. He says all history is in some measure a fall from the sacred, a limitation and diminution of its power. What then would be a spiritual point of view? What would it include in therapy and in psychoanalysis? Well, first of all, and this I always stress, would be an attitude of mystery. The experience of human nature and of all creation as essentially mysterious, to know what it is that we don't know, and to hold off that part of our minds which requires explanation, which requires understanding of mechanisms, which explains that our patients, our clients, our leaders do this or do that, or this people does it for this reason because they are materially deprived. To hold off on explanation, to keep the self open, to keep the instrument of knowing, the part of ourselves that knows, open to possibility. This is Eliade again in a book on shamanism. There is always a kernel in human experience that remains refractory to explanation. And this indefinable, irreducible element perhaps reveals the real situation of man in the cosmos. And Joseph Campbell, in his recent book, The Power of Myth, writes, "The mystery has been reduced to a set of concepts and ideas, and emphasizing these concepts and ideas can short-circuit the transcendent, connoted experience. An intense experience of mystery is what one has to regard as the ultimate religious experience." So this attitude would also include a sense of the cosmos and of nature as sacred, and that all human beings and all creatures are in some way sacred and are included in this sense of the sacred. In Christianity, the individual human being is exalted. It also means having a cosmological as opposed to a materialist perspective of reality. That would mean the sense that there is a design, that there is a harmony in nature, that there are appropriate relations in nature. It also means a consistent attitude of hesitation and doubt, that these are not unmanly attitudes. We do not have to rush into action, or merely obsessive. Glenn Tinder, a theologian, in an article in the Atlantic wrote, "Hesitation expresses consciousness of the mystery of being and the dignity of every person." A spiritual point of view would also include a basic distrust of all man-made institutions, being suspicious that they may reflect accretions or congealing of power in the hands of individuals which can be abused, and a trusting instead of the numinous, of the deeper, of the spiritual dimensions of human beings. In the clinical setting, this means an attitude toward clients which stresses suffering but does not consider our patients as pathological, but people who have a fate which they share in common with us. It would tend to regard clinical conditions as spiritual crises, not as diseases. The aim of our work would be human growth, even enlightenment, but that's again a very difficult word to define, not cure. Now, to gain a spiritual point of view, one needs to have a path. Now, here I'm in over my head in a lot of this, as you, I'm sure, can realize, but when it comes to trying to describe paths to this, it becomes particularly dicey. And I'm not going to say what the path that any one person should take. There are a number of paths. The traditional religions certainly can be a past, but they have a limitation in that the churches, the traditional structures, often want to interpret how you should experience the spiritual domain. My own background is anything but one of traditional religion. I was raised as a secular German Jew with highly developed rational reasoning side, rejecting the whole notion of the spiritual or the divine, and have had to go through not only personal analysis and therapy, which didn't get me very far, but most of the workshops that have been offered from California to the East Coast and back, the Graf work, and I probably should hesitate to say a certain amount of transformational chemical assistance along the way as well. Meditation is the most time-honored way of approaching this in meditation retreats, where people spend several days in silence and attend to the divine within and without, is a very powerful way of opening up to this realm. Now, in clinical work, what does this, well, first as we consider the self as we discuss it and look upon it in this, from this point of view, how do we consider the self? How would we redefine or expand our notions of the self in this context? The self is one of those words that is used both in psychology and in religion. Sometimes it's spelled with a small s in psychology. When it has a big S, it's probably more being used in religion. The big S self is kind of the ultimate self. The small s self is just kind of like self, you know. The self in psychology, the small s self, connotes something more literal. It's a little more like ego. And there's huge literature, as some of you who are in psychology know, about the difference between ego and self, and I'm not going to get into that. But the self, in that frame of reference, is something bounded, tends to be seen as pretty much coterminous with the individual person, sort of ends at the boundaries of the skin, and it's associated with individuals. And there's a great deal about the self from the standpoint of self-representation as a kind of aggregate of internalized self-representations as these have become part of the larger self through experience and incorporation. We think of the self in psychology as largely from the standpoint of agency or functions that it has. And we think of people with strong selves or weak selves. And I'm exaggerating the distinction between the self in psychology and religion to make the point. There's a lot of overlap. The self, in the spiritual sense, the self with a larger S, if not a big S, has been defined by Jung, by Gregory Bateson, Joanna Macy, Erickson, and other psychologists of religion. This self is more metaphoric. This self is the self of space, and it's hard to talk about because when you talk about this self, you have to, it is no thing. It is, I often think of the observing self, for instance, the self that is aware of you. Then we have the awareness of that self, and we can imagine a kind of series of regressions back to the place where we are in some kind of ground of being in which other things, other people show up, but is no thing, is no structure in that sense. So self in that way becomes a kind of metaphor of possibility. It is the sourcefulness that we experience that connects us with what is around us. It is not limited to our integument. It is, in a sense, connected with all of reality. We're hearing now about the eco-self, the self that would identify us with nature, with the beauty and glory of the world around us. This self is the locus of wounding, and it's close to the notion of soul in this sense. We can be wounded in ourselves, in our souls. It is also the locus of transcendence and of transformation. Through this self with a large S, we connect with others, with our communities. It is a highly social kind of entity, but it also, as I say, connects us with the others out there. And George Klein, a psychoanalyst, used the term we-go, a kind of awkward term, to refer to this social self that is so intimately connected with others. This self has paradoxes connected with it. For instance, this self seems to have a desire, a longing to merge, to connect, to fuse with others, or in a mystical experience with all that is. This longs for this sense of oneness. But in the process of this surrender, this self, instead of disappearing, expands as it absorbs. It becomes something greater. We hear now a lot about the notion of ego death, that this letting go of self, this surrender of self, and then the rebirth of the sense of self that follows from that. The sense of self, or the self, is also connected, again with the capital S, is connected with the sense of I, which, as Erik Erikson particularly has wrote about this, is tied in with the core of the personality, of beingness, and of religious experience. This sense of I is at the center. Erikson put it in a lecture in Wellfleet in 1980. He says that's where the light is. And that sense of I is the source of values, of intention, of identity. Hedy Zonk, in a book called A Psychology of Ultimate Concern, which looks at the religious ideas of Erik Erikson, says that in Erikson's religious ideas, the I is the place where the self reaches beyond psychosocial identity to a larger experience of existence. So this self is not just a psychosocial self. This self is concerned with ultimate questions of life and death, of birth and rebirth, and of religious experience. There may be fundamental gender differences in the sense of self, although males and females all experience all of these dimensions. It may be that the ground of being, as the self connects with nature, is in some way female, and many writers have looked at it that way. Whereas the male principle in the self is more active, more inseminating, more penetrating. We also speak of the fragmentation and the sense of fragmentation or wholeness of self. And here, the self in the spiritual religious sense and the self in the psychological sense connect. And there's another way of looking at the dilemmas of the contemporary self are in terms of this lack of wholeness, the sense that we are fragmented, incomplete, or that we do not have a sense of harmony or wholeness or balance. Now, what are the clinical implications of this? First of all, it has meaning for the way the patient-therapist or counselor-client relationship goes. It means looking upon the client as someone of special value. It means, as much as possible, developing a context of equal power, or if that's not possible, to examine and acknowledge the power inequalities in the relationship. It means conceiving of the therapeutic task as involving enabling or empowering dimensions in the relationship. It means being unashamed of speaking of the power of love in the therapeutic or transformational process. Awareness in this context has a slightly different meaning than, say, insight does in the more traditional psychological sense. Awareness means bringing forth elements of the self that are unknown. It doesn't necessarily mean the repressed unconscious. It may be a greater awareness of those cultural habits of thought, opinions, structures, identifications with institutional ways of thinking that are unconscious, not by virtue of being repressed, but because they are like the water we swim in. They are like the everyday life of our experience. The task is to expand that sense of self and to expand the possibilities of choice and power for our sense of self. There is a fundamental dimension that we look upon in this work which has to do with wounds to the self. And there's a great deal of emphasis on wounds in this work. And wounds come from loss, from separation, from trauma. And there's a kind of paradox in wounds, which I think you've experienced. Wounds, on the one hand, can lead to a restriction of self, to a pulling back, to a cutting off. At the same time, it is through our wounds that we grow, if we can live with them, if we can manage them, if we can relate to another person, share them, have the wounds acknowledged, recalled, admitted to be true within families or in the therapeutic process, then that can lead to growth and transformation. Robert Bly says to men having been so much cut off from their wounds, he says, live in your wound. That's where your growth will be. That's where your power will be. That's where your ability to connect will come from. The therapeutic objective is to develop a sense of wholeness, to heal that fragmentation. And this may include something which was not part of the therapeutic enterprise originally. Freud's notions of the ability to love and to work needs an expansion. It has to include in this some sense of commitment to the human future, some sense of social responsibility, something that grows out of this larger self, the self that is connected beyond myself or my people to a larger global identification. 12-step work, the work with addicts, involves that commitment to service, to expanding the self to be devoted to the needs of other people. In the work itself, we may or may not use the language of the sacred, but I've been struck by the way certain words have come into our look at the therapeutic process which do involve the sacred, which we hadn't used so much years ago. And I'm thinking of words like commitment, contract, covenants, promises. Children have a strong sense of this kind of covenant that is involved in human relationships. When they speak about something is unfair. Where is the root of that? That again has to do with this deep sense in the core that there are somehow there is an order in nature and relationships that must be respected and not violated. Or when they say you promised, as if you've broken some sacred covenant if you don't fulfill a promise. What are the sources of healing in this expanded sense of self? Now, as I was trained, the traditional sources tend to be insight, or thought to be, insight, understanding, bringing forth memories of the past into the present. But if, from a spiritual point of view, the source of healing may be empowerment through connection, or as the Buddhist priest Thich Nhat Hanh says, through interbeing. We put much more stress on acknowledgement in the relationship, on affirming, on admitting mistakes, saying you're sorry, not just to a child, but to one another when we screw up in the therapeutic process. We're more aware of the healing that can go on between generations, for example, between children and old people. And more projects we're seeing across the country that involve children and old people coming together. Arthur Kornhaber has written, a psychiatrist, has written a book on the spiritual dimension of grandchild-grandparent relationships, or child-elderly relationships. And he tells a story about a little girl, Annie, age 7, who went into a nursing home. And there was as he describes it, a lifeless, seemingly lifeless old woman off in the corner of the nursing home, kind of, their head hanging down. And he came back a while later, and Annie had obviously spent some time with this lady, and she looked transformed, vitalized, light in her eyes, spirited, as he put it. And he said, "Annie, what did you do?" And she said, "I don't know, she looked kind of lonely sitting there, so I just combed her hair." And he writes this. He says, "This spiritual dimension of the self not only contains love, wonder, and joy, but has the capacity to illuminate and transform the young and the old. Children seem to sense the spiritual qualities of older people and can transform what society generally sees as useless people into valuable elders. The child's view confers power and influence on the aged, who often are ignorant of their own influence. But when love is present, children are blind to the wrinkles that so often blind everyone else." The healing process that I'm talking about here comes closer to the shamanic healing methods that are traditional and time-honored. Shamans have always known the power of animal spirits. And I often wonder, we talk a lot about our relationship with our pets, but I wonder what connection that has with the traditional animal spirits or power animals that have been the source of strength and of transformation and of power of native peoples throughout history. And also, the whole transpersonal realm, the realm in which, when we go into these non-ordinary states of consciousness, we connect with beyond ourselves, with other peoples. This seems to have a healing quality. I had an extraordinary experience the first time I did this holotropic breath work with Stanislav Grof. I was at a conference in Esalen, and there were about 40 people in the conference. We stayed toward the end of after the conference, and there were 11 of us that chose to do this breathing, with each one with a sitter, and there were several Russians who also were in the conference and did the breathing. This was a conference on the frontiers of health. And I had this, nothing happened for about a half an hour, this driving music, and then I found myself transported I became a Russian father, and I had a thought that I was a Russian father, or tell me your fantasies about how you're a Russian father. I actually became a Russian father. It was an authentic transpersonal experience, and this father had a 4-year-old child who was decapitated by Mongol invaders, and I suddenly, in a moment, understood what the fear and I understood the experience of those Russians in terms of invasions and in terms of what their experience of threat was. And it was by some kind of transpersonal human identification in this non-ordinary state of consciousness that this happened. There was another man there while this was going on who well, I didn't know it was him, but there was this, while I was breathing, I heard this blood-curdling scream coming from somebody in the room, and it turned out to be a Jewish businessman from Los Angeles whose story included the fact that he had either the cord around his neck or, well, that was for sure, but also his mother may have tried to choke him when he was a child. And he told me afterwards that he had spent about 10 years of analysis. He put it talking to some very interesting people, that is his analysts, about what was the matter with him. But in this one session, he was completely transported into the terror of that physical experience in that non-ordinary state of consciousness. And through the holding environment there and through the working through and the sharing of it afterwards was able, as he said, to get more healing from that experience than in 10 years of his previous therapy. This kind of healing, the use of non-ordinary states of consciousness, whether it's the holotropic breath work or shamanic methods, relies much more on the inner healing power of the organism. It's the healer in this case becomes more like a facilitator rather than an agent, say, of transference. I often think in this connection of the Wizard of Oz. You know in the story how the wizard is going to fix all these problems for, get courage to the cowardly lion, and he's going to give brains to the scarecrow, and a heart to the Tin Man, and then he's shown out to be a humbug, and he's really trapped, the wizard. He's defrocked, and but then he discovers what he has to do, which is that he enables them to discover the power that they had within themselves all along. So he acts, in effect, as a kind of shamanic healer. Now, in the concluding few minutes, I want to talk a bit about the global crisis as a spiritual crisis. We have a kind of double-edged, interrelated crisis of civilization now. We have the crisis of international relationships and the terrible threat of force that we're now faced with nuclear weapons and high-tech weapons, and the ominous situation in the Gulf, from which hopefully we will survive, because ultimately the balance of power is so overwhelming in one direction, but that may not always be the case. We may not always be so fortunate, if that can be considered fortunate. The other part of it is the ecological crisis that I referred to, which is the slow death of species and of life on the planet as we know it. How will we respond to this ecological crisis? How do we learn what motivates? We know something about what motivates individuals when they're facing a health crisis or an emotional crisis to be motivated to change. We know very little about what motivates large groups or whole nations to change. Just a word about what the source of the crisis is as I see it. First is the extreme, and I've referred to this, to which we have carried our techno-materialist way of approaching the world. The separation from one another that this crisis reflects, and from nature. The extreme reliance upon force and domination to solve our problems. Erik Erikson called this separation among people pseudo-speciation, as if we were not all one species, all one being, but that we were different species. Above all, this means the exaltation of one's national group to elevate oneself. And theologian Glenn Tinder puts it very well. He says, the idealism in our time is commonly a form of collective pride. Human beings in this nationalistic pseudo-speciation through polarizing and dichotomizing tendency of the organism in the service of the national effort. And we've seen how the demonization of the other works in this connection. Religion is used, the holy war or the new order of democracy, and these kind of ideological slogans that have a kind of religious cast but are used to mask a political purpose when the realities are really far more complex. What is called for then in this situation? First of all, and we hear this over and over, is we need to have a wider sense of human identity. This means, going back to Erickson, the discovery of that core self, that true I from which authentic human connection emanates. And here's how Erickson put it not many years ago. He said, an overweening conscience can find peace only by always believing that the budding I harbors a truthfulness superior to that of all authorities, because this truth is the covenant of the I with God, the I being even more central and more pervasive than all parent images and moralities. In other words, get back to the sense of one's humanity, question the blandishments, question the manipulation of our perception. It is only from that that true internationalism can possibly emerge. And finally, I want to speak a little bit about Lee Atwater. This may seem out of context here, but Lee Atwater, you all know who he is. Anybody who doesn't know who Lee Atwater is? Well, he was the architect of Bush's campaign, an absolutely ruthless demonizer of the other for power purposes to get his guy elected no matter what. And one time he said he was going to hook, well, it was just filled with bigoted statements and attacking of the Dukakis campaign, for which Dukakis, who he attacked personally. And now he is facing death. And in an article this month in Life magazine, he says he has found, quote, a new spiritual presence in his life. And here are some of the things he says, which are, to me, quite extraordinary. He said, my illness helped me to see what was missing in society is what was missing in me. A little heart, a lot of brotherhood. The 80s were about acquiring wealth, power, prestige, I know. I acquired more wealth, power, and prestige than most. But you can acquire all you want and still feel empty. What power wouldn't I trade for a little more time with my family? What price wouldn't I pay for an evening with friends? It took a deadly illness to put me eye to eye with that truth, but it is a truth that the country, caught up in its ruthless ambitions and moral decay, can learn on my dime. I don't know who will lead us through the 90s, but they must be made to speak to this spiritual vacuum at the heart of American society, this tumor of the soul. I've come a long way since the day I told George Bush that his kinder, gentler theme was a nice thought, but it wouldn't win us any votes. I used to say that the president might be kinder and gentler, but I wasn't going to be. How wrong I was. There is nothing more important in life than human beings, nothing sweeter than the human touch. This month marks my 40th birthday, that deadline I set for achieving my life's goals. I lie here in my bedroom, my face swollen from steroids, my body useless and in pain. I will probably never play the guitar or run again. I can only hope to walk. The doctors still won't answer that nagging question of mine. How long do I have? 3 weeks, 3 months, 3 years? I try to live as if I have at least 3 years, but some nights I can't go to sleep. So fearful am I that I will never wake up again. I receive a few visitors when I am up to it, pray, watch movies, talk with my friends, and stare blankly out into the darkness. The terror of it all is blinding, but I find that comfort is sometimes within reach. I find Lee Atwater a kind of symbol of our time. What will it take for us? We are all facing death individually and collectively. How can it become real for us so we may experience its transforming power before, like Atwater, we have reached the point of no return? Preserving the planet seems a fight worth fighting. J.M. Coetzee, in his novel about apartheid, which he calls, ironically, Age of Iron, because he means, again, by that, the loss of feeling, the loss of caring, he puts these words in the mouth of a dying woman whose death, again, is symbolically linked to the death of the culture around her, the loss of feeling. She says, such a good thing, life, such a wonderful idea for God to have had. The best idea there had ever been, a gift, the most generous of all gifts, renewing itself endlessly through the generations. So I think it is the responsibility of each of us to become self-conscious to such a degree that life will indeed be renewed through the generations. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mack. We'll not take any questions from the audience or any comments.
Yeah.
Would you care to hazard a distinction between mystical and spiritual, and failing that, could you offer a definition of spiritual, please?
Well, one of the hazards of wandering into this domain is we're dealing with a domain of intense subjectivity, where we're trading metaphors, we're trading experiences, and none of us can point to something and say, you know, it's this thing right here. So I have to speak again from my own experience. But what I mean by but mystical is a little easier in a way. Mystical is that sense of mystery, of the unknown, that we are somehow in some sometimes joyful, sometimes troubling way, connected beyond ourselves, that there is a way that we are, that we experience in more or less dramatic form the oneness that of all categories. I know my own experience of this has occurred in particularly with the breath work or with LSD experiences, where there is a breaking down of categories, of outside, of inside, of self and other, of material and spirit, that there is this just numinous sense, that there's a sense of oneness and of connection, and it's very, very powerful, and something follows from it. That's the other thing. It's not just a high, it's like a sense of the intense, extreme value of all that is, that it is somehow magnificent and beautiful, and that you want to do something about it. In other words, you want to stop the killing, you want to stop the destruction of species, you want to be participant in some way in the ecological problem. So it's a state from which there is this experience of the divinity of creation, from which one wants to do something to preserve, to protect. Now, spiritual I think is a much more general term, which has to do with in many definitions, it means the higher self, the sense of a higher purpose or higher value, the sense that there are spirits, that there is an exalted dimension to our existence and to nature, that there is some kind of energy that informs, that we participate in, that informs all that is around us. I think it's a broader term and probably more variously interpreted, and I feel a little less comfortable with that. Yeah?
At the beginning of your talk, I missed the very beginning, but when I did come in, you were talking about Mircea Eliad's definition of, well, if not definition, statement about how and why we got separated from this mutual connection with nature and God, which you did mention once in your talk, I noticed. And the definition that she gave forth, and you were sort of...
Somebody might have asked me to define God if I had...
But it sounded very abstract, and I've been thinking about it myself, and it seems to me, as you were speaking, it sort of flashed upon me that the way we use words and writings, specifically, you talked about Native people a lot, and what really separates the sort of pre-literate or native or indigenous cultures from so-called civilization is writing. And if you look at writing, the origins of writing, the earliest writing certainly is for specific reasons, i.e. Cataloging conquests and keeping track of tributes from subject populations. And so you can see this kind of social milieu, which is pre-literate, and then what came afterwards. And it seems to me, not that we have to give up writing, because even so-called pre-literate people, like native people here, which most people don't realize in this country, had writing. Like the wampum belts, for example, were actual records of major events in tribal history over very long periods of time. The Mayans and the Aztecs had books which were actually destroyed by the Spanish because it didn't fit their, what their purposes were to have that widely known. And it seems to me that one of the major problems we have, certainly with educated people, is the way we use words and, the publish or perish, writing papers, that everything has to be
peer review. Peer review.
Yeah, but as a status, it means of domination and control, and it's the way you get ahead and you get more perks in society. And so people use language as a sort of a weapon and a way of mystification over ordinary people. And so I think that's something that really is worth looking at and examining.
Yeah, no, I find what you say very interesting, the way language, particularly written language, academic language in a sense, is a way of separating, of using knowledge to disconnect and to cut ourselves off from the numinous. Yeah.
I wonder whether you would be willing to relate the experiences you described to psychotic states of mind as well, or you think there is something completely different is happening?
Well, this is originally when LSD came to the United States from Hoffman, and it was synthesized in Europe, and it was used in the 50s to replicate psychotic states. That was the original idea of it. It wasn't used for healing or for personal transformation or growth, because it seemed that people would have these altered perceptions and would have this kind of disorganization of categories and boundaries. And but the distinction has to do with the fact that, well, I have to tell you a story to illustrate the distinction, okay? This has to do with there's a yogi who's hanging from a tree on the grounds of a mental hospital. And he's swinging, and he's doing fine, and he seems to be enjoying nature and life and everything around him. And there, sitting on the ground below him, is an inmate of the mental hospital in a straitjacket. And so Yogi seems quite mad to the inmate, so he says, "How come you're up there, swinging and having a great time and communing with nature, and I'm here, in this rugged and in this straitjacket?" And Yogi says, he says, "Well, I'm not crazy. I mean, I see exalted visions, and I am connected with the great, with Shiva and Shakti and Kali and all the mythic figures." And so the inmate says, "That's funny. I see visions too. I'm connected with Jesus and with Mary and with the Holy Spirit." And the yogi says, "Yeah, but the difference is I know who to tell my visions to." So I think, I don't want to just let it stand there. I mean, it probably should let it stand there, but it does have to do with how one organizes the totality of one's life, how one manages impulses, social appropriateness, the ability to organize daily life, to work, the fact of having a visionary or mythic or non-ordinary states of consciousness, even spontaneously, does not make somebody psychotic or disturbed. When it's overwhelming and fragmenting and disturbs function, then you're dealing with another matter. So that would be a beginning response to you. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a way of evaluating, in your mind, any kind of objective truth or falsehood in experiences like this? I have in mind pointed out earlier, you talked about how some of these experiences might well be kind of an opening into a higher realm, but then you also compared it to this little girl that you'd met who talked about foxes and bears and magic wands and things, and they were as real to her as anything else, kind of that mythic realm. And it seems to me that kind of from an objective point of view, we might distinguish one of those as being more objectively real or veridical than the other. And so I'm wondering whether, is there a way of making those kinds of distinctions?
Well, this has been tried. Ken Wilber is probably the most learned taxonomist of the hierarchy of human psychic experiences, and he goes all the way from the pre-person experiences of infantilism all the way up the hierarchy through the Freudian levels to the Oedipal to the subtle body to the cosmic body. I mean, right up to the top, and where there's sort of ultimate suchness, at the highest level, and that's fine. But he's not a clinician, and this is not as it works with actual living people. And there's a kind of debate between him and Stan Grof in terms of how experientially in non-ordinary states of consciousness you actually have those experiences. I mean, for example, in my own breathwork experiences, I may go from being at the mother's breast to being in the birth canal to being in a very aggressive, low-level power thing to pressures of the bladder where only excretory, that second chakra, first chakra things are happening, and then I'll have openings to the divine and to the spiritual realm. And I think again, it gets back to what you were saying before, that the mind has this tendency to want to is there a verb, academize? To what?
Academicize.
Yeah, things, and to create hierarchies of value, and I would tend to stay away from that. It's not my style, okay? I mean, I tend to be more a Groffian than a Wilberian in that regard. I think that this kind of hierarchy to the ultimate nirvana. Yeah, I suppose there is some way to get to the highest states of enlightenment, and that's higher than shamanic spirit contact, and there's been a lot written about, so the shamans, do they ever get to the high level of the highest yogis? And, there's a big debates about that. I don't know what I think about that. People have a lot of opinions about it, I know. Yeah?
Seems like between, religion and, psychoanalysis, like in religion, perhaps articulating your experience isn't necessarily as important as experiencing it, perhaps. And in psychoanalysis, it seems that there's a great deal of importance stressed on being able to articulate your experiences, past and present. And I don't see that you can bridge that gap between religion and psychoanalysis.
Good. Well, we had a discussion about that earlier today, whether you can really have it. Is there something about psychoanalysis, by its very structure, by its very nature, which precludes a spiritual point of view, or including a religious point of view? And I think an argument could be made for that. On the other hand, the proponents, when I was in training in the 50s and early 60s, there was psychoanalysts did emphasize that a real analysis, you didn't have a real analysis if you were just talking. You had to have a very powerful experience of your feelings or of your relationship with yourself or your parents or whatever it was. So the experiential dimension certainly was not precluded in psychoanalysis. I think the other way that the most profound spiritual openings are ineffable, cannot be put into words. I think that's true. And I think to talk about spiritual experience is something that, even if you're good at it and have been at it for a long time, is extremely difficult to do. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have enormous transforming power and healing power, because you can't give it language readily.
How would you work that in psychoanalysis if it's ineffable?
Well, I think you create a context in which people can more readily get into non-ordinary states of consciousness. You be there with them, and the sharing of the experience is more voluntary, not so much has to be verbalized so much, and And people do find something to say about it. They do want to share these ineffable experiences, even if they can't give words to it. In my graph group, I have a group that I'm very intimate with that I've been doing this graph experience with, and sometimes a person will, you'll see somebody who's, having tremendous, powerful openings to the demonic, and they're shaking and they become animals, and you see the just intense, and then they open up to some seeming beatific opening to God, and see, I did say, and and so when it's all over, everybody. This may be someone who seemed to have the most powerful experience of the group that day, so you want to hear in the sharing what happened, and they say, I don't know, I had a very powerful experience, but I can't tell you what it was, but I feel wonderful, or I still feel tense, or and that's all you get. And the healing goes on, and it's very frustrating to somebody who's as verbal as I. Yeah, but what happened? Who did you see? What animals? Who were you when you were growling like that? And I don't know. So.
So you're talking about inducing spiritual experiences, then, right? Is that the role?
In non-ordinary states of consciousness, we have much more access to what would be called the perinatal level, the level around the stages of birth, and through birth beyond to transpersonal experience, which would be the identification with spirits, with animals, with that. And that is very healing. It seems to be very healing. It certainly has been in my experience and for many of the people I've worked with. And that's a whole discussion itself, the use of in the West, the shamans know about this, but in the West, the use of non-ordinary states of consciousness for therapy and healing is a very important area. Yeah, in the back.
Do you have any thoughts about people who have been healed of serious illnesses which science cannot explain at all? How does spirituality connect with this? Or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there was an article in the New England Journal of Medicine on cults in medicine, and there's sort of a kind of a Western critique of cults, and there was a somewhat ironic letter to the editor that made the distinction between cults and authentic spiritual healing, and then quoted somebody at the end of the letter which said that God even sometimes heals through doctors. And the point, no, I don't. What the spontaneous, again, there's a study being done of spontaneous remissions from cancer by the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and there's just nothing that's known. What kind of harmony in the total experience of the body takes place, I don't know. There seemed to be the power of the spirit to heal, and again, that's not an area that I'm particularly knowledgeable, but there are many people involved in, like Deepak Chopra and Norman Cousins wrote about this in a book, and John Borisenko, who look at that healing power of the inner force, the inner spirit, and of human relationship and connection, and the healing power that has. But what the mechanism is what I think you're asking, and psychoimmunoendocrinology is a field that tries to look at those mechanisms. Herb Benson and his followers do. But what ultimately connects the spirit and the body in that is a mystery. Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any room for theories or beliefs in reincarnation in dealing with a spiritual realm, and therefore positing ourselves as spiritual entities, which may mean we have a pre-existent state prior to the body. And I'm just wondering if that fits in any way with dealing with analysis on a spiritual level.
Sure. Once you are open to the notion that the spirit that the body is temporary and the spirit is eternal, or the soul is eternal, something which I surely never believed when I was growing up, or wouldn't even countenance. But the idea that the near-death experiences, for example, you're familiar with the near-death phenomenon, suggests that there is some disjunction between the body and the spirit, that there are ways of knowing and perceiving that exist in the spirit or the soul or in consciousness that are separate from the body's senses. And if it's true that there can be a disjunction between from the body and the spirit, then there can be past lives, and there are a lot of people that can document that. That's not an area that I'm comfortable speaking about. I mean, I'm far enough out on the yogi's limb as it is. You know, I'm not sure I want to get out on the small branches. You know.
So you say that there is some efficacy to past life therapy, or, I mean...
I'm open to the possibility. A lot of things show up for you when you open yourself up in this way. You know. Things I never thought I would pay the slightest, I could possibly consider seriously. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about the value of emotional discharge, crying, laughing, trembling for healing?
Well, yeah. I mean, it depends on the context, doesn't it? I mean, you know, if you're crying because you're abandoned and there's nobody there, and it's just a reinforcement of pain and loneliness and loss, then it's hardly healing. If it occurs because a person is in, or it's part of a repeated rejection and just deepens the hurt, that's not healing. But if it's in a context where there are people who love you and who care and a holding environment, it's extremely, it's essential, it's a fundamental part of healing. So it depends on the envelope, you know, on the holding place that it happens in. Yeah.
Could you say a little more about the breathing exercises you were talking about? Are they at all related to the breathing practices of Hatha Yoga? If you know anything about
It's a little more aggressive. I mean, it's more deliberate. The way it works is you get people paired in a room in a you know, explaining the technique, and with a map of the mind that involve a brief understanding of the level, the biographical level, the level of memory, and then the perinatal level and the transpersonal level, the places you may visit when you go into this state, and then with a sitter, with the eyes shaded or closed, and with kind of evocative driving music at first, but then more sustaining and finally more soothing, uplifting music at the end, and deep relaxation exercise to begin with, and a deep rapid breathing. The person goes into a state which has a lot in common with an LSD trip or a shamanic journey or a deep meditative state, and in that non-ordinary state all kinds of experiences happen, which some are disturbing and anxiety-producing, but on the whole result in a very powerful kind of healing experience. I could talk to you more about it individually.
Is it always the case, though, if someone does the breathing technique that's being taught, that they always have this sort of experience, or does it sometimes happen?
Well, people sometimes will say, nothing happened. I didn't get anywhere. I just kind of went to sleep, or I went into a trance. That's 1 out of 10 people. But it's remarkable. I mean, I'm a fairly, tough nut in a way. And I was amazed the first time I did this. I was in touch with my mother, my biological mother, who died when I was a few months old. I experienced the grief there. I experienced my father's grief. I had this experience I mentioned to you, identification with the Russian father, and I mean, just this extraordinary opening to this realm of transpersonal identification, and that doesn't always happen. It happened to one of the Soviets in the room. It was really very moving. He had this just tremendously powerful spiritual opening, and this was before Glasnost had gone quite as far as it went, at least until very recently, and he said, he was in connection with God and with had this very powerful spiritual experience. He said, we're not supposed to have that, I know, but I saw God, and it was so touching. He hadn't had that kind of experience since he was an older man, since he was much younger. I mean, it's not, but if I've never seen a situation where something didn't happen. I mean, a person may not be satisfied with what happened. It may be, I didn't have a dramatic encounter with, the peacocks and the gods and the goddesses, but still something healing happened, something meaningful happens when you actually see the process, particularly over repeated experiences over time. Yeah.
Why don't we make this the last question, because we're...
Okay.
Okay. I was wondering if you would be willing to discuss the circumstances that led you to so actively seek and study your spirituality after having had the upbringing that you described.
Thank you very much. Oh boy. Well, it's a little bit like this, who is it, Peggy Lee's song who keeps saying, "Is that all there is?" You know, I mean, I felt this sense of frustration in my life. I mean, also, it had a lot to do with my children. I mean, I probably would not have, this wouldn't have happened if it had not been for my oldest son, who was, when he was, I guess about 18, 19, and as a teenager, he was a very competitive, obnoxious boy. I mean, beat up on his younger brother, and he was very rough, you know it all, had to be tops in everything, obnoxiously competitive, you know, not as bad as Lee Atwater maybe, but getting there. And then he, at some point, something happened to him when he was about 18 or 19. He did silver mind control and transcendental meditation, and then he took an est-like workshop in which he had this kind of agape love experience in which he became, he had a kind of peak experience, a kind of, in which he suddenly became overwhelmed with the feeling of love and connection and what a fool he'd been and what a jerk he'd been. And then he came home from this workshop and he had this beatific look on his face, you know, and he was hugging his mother and hugging me, and I just want to tell you how much I love you. And Sally and I looked at each other and said, what is going on here, you know? I mean, this kid, you know, where has he been? So, and we were saying to ourselves, listen, if it lasts, don't knock it, you know, whatever. You know, and he never went back. He never reverted back. I mean, it was permanent. He went on with his own path. I mean, he went, you know, studied holistic medicine and took a number of spiritual workshops and, you know, went on his own kind of New Age spiritual path. But he remained a truly gentler, kinder person forever from that experience. And he insisted we go to one of these est-like workshops, and that was 1980 or so. And I was also at that point, having written this book about Lawrence and the Middle East and doing workshops, and I felt there was something incomplete in my own experience, that I was somehow in my psychoanalytic work cut off, you know, the word I've used several times, cut off from much of experience. I have this image, which I won't belabor, but just mention that there were like coconuts with little tiny pinholes to reality, you know, and that, you know, as in the Old Testament, you can't look on the face of God because it's overwhelming, so you have to shield, you know. Well, we're like cut off from the divine, and the most we can do is try to enlarge the pinhole just a little bit, just a little bit more in. And I had this feeling of being just too much cut off from what is and from what's possible. And when I did that workshop that he took us to, there was a little bit of an opening, and then I began to get this kind of hunger, you know, for more and more of this sort of, might be called spiritual. It's what Barbara Marx Hubbard in the first quote I gave of this hunger for what we're deprived of in this culture in the way of mystical connection or whatever. I discovered myself as a repressed mystic, I guess. I don't know. But once I got started, it's like, and you get the dark with the light. So you don't ever stop, because every time you open up to more of this power of connection, you're also opening up the dark areas as well. So you have to keep going to, you know, the healing process never ends. Danny was always saying to me, I've got to take this other workshop, it has such healing power. I said, Danny, what is all this healing business? You had a good childhood and your mother and I treated you well, and how come you got to do so much healing? I didn't know you were that injured, you know? And then, you know, but I realized that the human condition is infinitely wounding and infinitely needing of healing in a sense. So, and I mean, I'm sure those of you that once you get launched on some kind of road for your own opening, healing, transformation, whatever you want to call it, you're on this, you're just on the road, and you're never going to get there I mean, does that make sense? I don't know. Yeah, okay.
Well, thank you very
All
much.
right, thank you.